They said the jungle on Wardrastnheim never slept, but that wasn't true. It dreamed instead, dreams of motion, of whispers moving between the vines, of wet leaves brushing armor as if the foliage itself had learned the shape of a man. We were a patrol of 12 when we entered the tree line. Only the Emperor knew how many walked back out. They told us it was a reconnaissance sweep. Mark the terrain, map Xenospore, and report. But the map they gave us was wrong before we took the first step. The ground breathed where it should not, and the sky above was a web of canopies that let in no stars, only green firelight that seemed to crawl from the soil up. I remember thinking, this place doesn't want us here. I was right. When the first guardsman disappeared, we blamed the jungle. When the second went missing, we blamed each other. By the time we realized what hunted us, it was already inside our heads, moving through our memories like knives through soft fruit. The Drukhari didn't just kill. They harvested fear, refined it, turned it into something sacred to them. I didn't understand that then. I do now. If you can still hear this transmission, if you've ever walked in places that make you feel watched even when you're alone, stay with me. There are things in the dark that feed on attention, and by listening you help me fight them. Like, share, and subscribe if you believe men like us deserve to be remembered. Every witness keeps the fear human. They briefed us inside a dropship that smelled of spilled recaf and old oil, and I remember thinking the stink would be a mercy compared to the jungle. 12 names, 12 faces washed green by lumen strips, 12 lasguns with charge packs counted twice, and blessed once by a harried Ministorum priest who had promethium beneath his fingernails. Sergeant Cade stood at the ramp reading the sky like a man checking a wound. He had the kind of stillness that made other men shuffle. Even the Vox operator Bren kept his fidgeting quiet. I sat on the bench with my back to the hull, helmet in my lap, the edge of the visor digging a thin crescent into my palms. My name is Guardsman Iovan Hale, 117th Vordrast line, and on that day I still believed maps. The tree line began as a wall that didn't know it was a wall. When the ramp dropped, heat hit us like a hand and stayed. Sound came next, not birdsong or wind, but the chew and whir of insect life working in shifts. The canopy leaned together overhead until daylight became a syrup, filtered through 1,000 wet leaves. The first step sank. The second step learned. The third decided whether to come back out. Cade signaled the wedge and we bled off the landing zone. Boot treads printing the mud with the Imperial double-headed eagle until the weight of us turned the Aquila into smear. Discipline holds best when nothing moves. The jungle moved. Vines pressed flack like curious fingers. Ferns brushed our knees with the slyness of thieves. Something with too many legs stitched a line across my gauntlet and vanished into moss so deep it swallowed the shape of my boot. Vox beads kept our breathing intimate. Each man's exhale became the next man's doubt. Auspex shows nothing warm beyond us, Bren murmured, and the sentence fell apart as it left his mouth, the tail bitten off by a burst of static that had no business in trees. Cade raised 2 fingers. Keep formation, eyes left and right, minds forward. We couldn't see the sky and the jungle had its own geometry. It worked in loops. We walked a ridge that became a gully that became a ridge that remembered being a gully. The ground sweated. Mud climbed calves like a slow ambition. Voss, our point man, carried a machete that had killed more plants than enemies. He cut a thin green path the rest of us widened with our mass. The jungle bled sap the color of old honey and it smelled faintly sweet. The sweetness of rot eaten by something patient. Markings, Ilian said softly, and we all looked where she pointed. Bark cut at shoulder height, 3 small slashes and a longer one that curved like a smile. We hadn't cut them. None of us owned that handwriting. We left them undisturbed because doctrine likes evidence more than answers. The first disappearance wasn't a scream. It was a subtraction. We halted at Cade's fist and discovered Janu no longer lived between Voss and me. His footprint ended at a puddle that pretended to be water until you watched it breathe. I stared until my eyes made him out of reflections, a shoulder, a cheek, a lasgun stock. Cade kept his voice balanced on the knife edge between command and prayer. Janu, report. The Vox gave him back a hush that felt intentional. Bren cycled channels and shrugged with the shame of a craftsman betrayed by his tools. We ran a line and pulled the puddle apart. What came up was vine and water and a strip of fatigues that might have been torn or might have been chewed. No blood, which should have comforted me. It didn't. Blood is evidence of a thing that knows how to finish. The jungle had different manners. It liked a slow conversation. Drukhari? Voss whispered. Not because he had reason, but because the word sits in any man's pocket once he's told it. A coin you worry with your thumb. Cade looked like he'd swallowed it and decided to starve instead. We do not say the enemy's name until we've seen the enemy's face, he said quietly, as if names were doors. We made camp early because the jungle declared night whenever it pleased. Flayed vines became cordon. Auspex poles blinked pale in the green dusk. We ate protein that had the memory of meat and drank water boiled until it tasted of discipline. The priest attached to our patrol, Brother Eamon, stood among us with a battered aquila in his hands and eyes that watched leaves more than souls. He spoke a litany for Janu as if the emperor took attendance. When the Amen arrived, birds, or something that wanted us to hear birds, called from 3 directions at once, the same 3-note pattern in different throats, the sound polite enough to be mocking. Sleep works like a deal. You give the world your vulnerability in exchange for mourning. I slept in slices. Each time I closed my eyes, the jungle leaned closer to listen, and when I opened them, it leaned back into its own shadow. At some hour that had no number in it, Bren's whisper brushed my ear through the vox bead. Hail, check perimeter, eastern pole flickered. I rose into a world of wet black and moved through ferns that stroked my thighs. The eastern pole stood where we'd planted it, its lumen a tiny saint. In the green shine of it, I saw Janu's face. Not the whole of it, only his left eye, set among leaves at the height of my cheekbone, the iris still and black as a nail head. I didn't shout. I did what the world asked. I knelt and recognized the lie at once. Not an eye, a seed pod that had learned shape. It cracked in the light, and a feathering of spores lifted off like dust from a prayer book. I backed away slower than fear wanted. Behind me, the ferns rearranged themselves to make a path for someone else. The breath at my ear came a fraction too late to be mine. Hail, Bren said again. You're at my position. I wasn't. The jungle had taken his voice and traded it around like a story. Dawn arrived without light, only a softening of edges. We ate while standing. Cade counted us twice and pretended to reach 12. The Auspex reported absence with authority. We moved because stopping is a kind of belief. The ground pitched up into a slope stitched with roots, slick as tendon. I climbed with lasgun hung on its sling, palms blacked with sap that clung like the memory of a sin. At the top, the jungle opened into a shallow bowl of peat where water sat like thought. A frog the size of my hand blinked at me with algal indifference, and when it opened its mouth, a fine mist blew out that smelled of copper and made my gums ache. Left, Ilian said softly from my shoulder, and I turned to see the print in the peat. A boot like ours, but wrong in the proportion. Too narrow at the toe, too long in the arch. The impression not of weight, but of decision. Around it, 3 tiny punctures where something like claws had kissed the ground for balance. We measured it with our fear. Human, Voss said, because men like believing in the evil they understand. Brother Amen reached down as if to bless the track, then stopped, his fingers a hand's breadth from the surface, as if the air above the print had teeth. We followed not because Cade said to, but because the print knew how to walk and we were tired of drowning. The trail threaded between trunks ribbed like the bellies of great fish. Lianas draped down as if the canopy had grown weary of holding itself and wanted to be ground again. One by one we passed beneath a low branch that wore a girdle of thorns fine as hair. When I ducked, the thorns tasted the crown of my helmet. The hiss was small, too small, like a secret gasping. I smelled almond and then forgot why I knew almond meant danger. We broke into a clearing that didn't exist until we entered it. A perfect circle where the canopy stepped back and the ground presented itself as if for an inspection. In the center lay a pile of stones stacked with a care that insulted the surrounding wilderness. Upon it, a strip of flak, 3 last cartridges, 1 data slate scarred with heat. Cade lifted the slate, and it woke to his touch with a sigh like a dying animal. Across the screen in blocky administratum font scrolled a sentence that had no right to be here, stamped with our unit crest and the timestamp of 10 minutes from now. Do not turn around. The screen on Cade's data slate burned the words into us before anyone could think. Do not turn around. I felt the urge move through the patrol like a shiver under skin, one muscle twitching, another resisting. Discipline won barely. Cade shut the slate, slipped it into his pack, and spoke without turning his head. Eyes front. No one moves. We froze there in the clearing, every breath a separate prayer. The jungle waited with us, listening. Behind me came the faintest sound, softer than fabric, a sigh shaped like curiosity. A hand brushed my shoulder, light, familiar, and my mind gave it Janu's weight before reason caught up. I didn't move. If I moved, I'd break the spell that kept us in the Emperor's sight. Something close to my ear said my name the way a memory does, gentle, apologetic. Cade's voice snapped through the vox. Forward, now. We obeyed. The clearing vanished behind us as if it had never been carved. None of us spoke about the footsteps that followed for half a kilometer, matching ours beat for beat. By midday, the humidity turned breath into liquid. Bren's vox unit hissed with its own heat, picking up scraps of transmissions that shouldn't exist. Nurse reporting in. Line of sight. Green silence. My own voice recorded and replayed from nowhere. Cade ordered the unit shut down. The hiss continued anyway, now faintly laughing between bursts of static. Brother Eamon tried to drown it with prayer, his Aquila shaking like a compass in the wrong field. We reached a river that pretended to flow. It pulsed instead, thick and sluggish, a vein in the planet's skin. The far bank glistened with webbing. Fine strands stretched between roots, each thread vibrating to a rhythm that almost matched our pulse. Voss tested it with his blade. The web split and bled clear. Sap, he said. The smell said otherwise, copper and perfume. We crossed one at a time, weapons high, and the water sucked at us as if unwilling to release its investment. On the opposite bank, we found what passed for shelter, a grotto under a fallen trunk big enough to house a tank. Cade called halt, rationed an hour for rest. The light inside the grotto came from fungus that glowed the color of old parchment. It pulsed faintly with each word spoken, a mimic eager to join the conversation. Bren took first watch. I sat beside him, chewing dried ration until it became dust. He broke silence with a whisper. What do you think it means? Don't turn around? Maybe it's what killed Janu, I said. Maybe it's what saved us. Outside, rain began to fall. Not drops but filaments, thin threads that hissed where they struck metal. They evaporated before reaching ground, leaving the air laced with the scent of scorched sugar. I watched the curtain of it and thought of the Drukhari stories told in barracks. Knives that drink fear, faces worn like trophies, laughter that skims along bone. In those stories, men die screaming. Here, men vanish. The difference felt deliberate. When the rain stopped, Bren rose to stretch and froze. His eyes fixed on something beyond the grotto. Movement, he said too quietly. I followed his gaze. Among the trees, a shape swayed, indistinct, human at first glance. Then it turned its head the wrong way. The helmet caught a glint of fungus light, Vordrast issue. Our own. I lifted my rifle. The shape didn't react. It only tilted as if studying us. Cade appeared at my shoulder, his voice steady. Identify yourself. The shape stepped closer and the forest answered by dimming. I saw it clearer then. A guardsman's armor flayed open, joints moving on tendons that weren't muscle. The face behind the visor was a mask of translucent skin stretched over nothing. Inside it, something pulsed like a heart that didn't belong there. It raised one hand in greeting, fingers too long, nails clicking together like language. Cade fired first. The bolt took it through the chest. It staggered, stumbled backward into the dark, leaving no sound of impact, no blood. Only the echo of that click repeated from every direction. We broke camp without order. Fear is a discipline of its own. It makes all men efficient. The jungle closed behind us and the path became narrower, more intimate, until branches brushed our helmets like blind hands. The temperature dropped, though the air stayed wet. When we finally stopped, it was not by command, but by consensus. We simply ran out of forward. Night found us. I lay awake counting breaths that weren't mine. Each one came from a different direction. The vox bead whispered fragments of an old hymn in a voice too beautiful to be human. Sleep tempted me with images of home. Vordrast's plains under honest rain. But every time I blinked, the jungle replaced the sky with green veils. At some point I realized the hymn was coming from my own throat. I bit my tongue until I tasted iron. At dawn, or what the hive clock claimed was dawn, we were 8. Voss gone. His bedroll lay neatly folded, his machete planted upright in the soil, the blade engraved overnight with a new symbol, 3 short slashes and a long curved smile. Cade didn't speak. He simply turned, took the lead again, and we followed. That's what soldiers do. We follow even when the world has stopped leading. The vines thickened, the air thinned, and every leaf seemed to lean toward us, listening. The jungle was learning our language. The night taught us a new language, and the morning spoke it back. We moved before the clock finished, deciding it was dawn. 8 shadows bleeding through green. The jungle inhaled when we exhaled and held its breath when we needed air. That's how we knew it was learning us. Sergeant Cade didn't say the word ambush, but he wore it like a second helm. I kept to his right with my laser gun low and my jaw clenched until it ached, trying to make my own breath smaller. Every plant seemed to have a mouth. Every mouth seemed to be counting. Bren tried to tune the vox speed to a clean frequency and only found versions of ourselves. Breach left, my voice said from the trees. Hale, you're trailing. Hold light, Ilian answered from nowhere, the same syllables she had used 3 hours before, untied from time and hung in the air like bait. Brother Eamon touched the Aquila to his lips and whispered that the Emperor is the breath between heartbeats. He sounded like he was apologizing for needing oxygen. We crested a bank of slick roots, the slope dropping away into a creek that didn't flow so much as rearrange itself. The surface shivered, broke, healed. Things that looked like lilies and weren't stared up with eyes that were not eyes. Cade signaled the rope across. I went second because the first man never lives and the third learns the lesson a fraction too late. The rope hummed with something inside it, a faint vibration like a hymn sung under one's breath. Halfway over, the creek exhaled cold, and a cloud of midges rose from the water in a single puff as if all their clocks had been wound to the same tick. I held my breath and felt the jungle smile. We reformed on the far bank. Mud took our footprints and made small replicas of them, shallow copies marching beside us for a dozen steps before losing interest. Ilian stopped, knelt, and brushed aside a mat of moss to reveal a human molar set like a bead in the soil. She wrapped it in a scrap of cloth as if you can still honor the dead when you don't know their name. Ship ashore, Bren muttered, some barracks phrase from an older life that meant nothing here. Cade gave him a look that asked for silence and got it. At midday we stopped in the shadow of a strangler fig that had murdered 3 other trees and celebrated by blooming. The flowers smelled like sweet meat left in the sun. Eamon said a short rite for Voss that sounded suspiciously like the rite he'd said for Janu. The Emperor keeps the same form for every receipt. While he spoke, I heard a second voice beneath his words, a polite counterpoint, amused. I looked up through the leaves and saw nothing but the ceiling of this world. Wet, patient, unjudging. I closed my eyes to check if the voice lived behind them and heard only my own teeth grind. The first real death came trying to keep us alive. Bren's auspex chirped a warning in the wrong key. He stepped to adjust it and the ground under him sighed open. Not a pit, not a trap, just soil deciding to be air. Cade snagged his harness and I grabbed Cade's elbow while Ilian belly flopped on the mud to spread her weight. Bren swung waist deep into black and came up with his legs slashed from hip to knee by something too fine to see. Blood darkened his fatigues and sheets. It smelled like iron and salt and new pennies. He didn't scream because he was busy biting through the strap of his Vox unit. The metal teeth snapped and the unit slid into the hole and the jungle closed its mouth and swallowed the taste of him. We hauled him out and dragged him beneath the strangler's roots. He lay on his back and watched the canopy with the eyes of a man who had just learned the size of the sky. I cinched a tourniquet while Ilian poured coagulant foam. Cade hovered with his hand on Bren's shoulder, as if he could pin the soul to the body with palm and will. Eamon murmured a litany over the wound, voice shaking, and as he spoke, the coagulant foamed in time with the words, a perverse echo that made me want to tear my ears off. Bren looked at me, at Cade, at the fig's ribbed trunk, and then at a patch of air just left of my face. He smiled at it the way you smile at a joke you don't want to admit you heard. Janu, he said softly. Sorry I left you. He went cold insidiously, the way metal cools after it has decided to spare your hand. We covered his face with a rag that had once been white and now remembered too many colors. Cade took Bren's tags and tucked them under the Aquila on Eamon's chest as if to make the priest into a reliquary. I expected him to order a fire to cauterize the ground. He didn't. We had enough smoke already. The jungle breathed wrong even when it was calm. We moved again because grief requires motion to be believable. The path grew narrow and then forgot it had ever been a path. Liana's brushed my helmet with the affection of parasites. Vines stroked our ankles as if measuring blood. Each time we paused, the silence deepened until it had vertebrae. Then something made the silence flinch. We heard laughter from a distance that never resolved, high and soft like glass being played by a wet finger. It moved around us without moving closer, mapping the shape of our fear. I began to notice small offerings placed high in the crooks of branches, coins soldered together into delicate cages, vertebrae threaded on wire, beetle wings caught in resin that smelled like wine. They were beautiful in the way lightning scars are beautiful. Ilian reached toward one, hand trembling, not to take it but to verify the reality of it. Cade caught her wrist. "Don't pay," he said. "All debts here compound." We reached a low valley where fog pooled in the roots like breath trapped under blankets. A shape stood in the middle distance, the silhouette of a man at ease, rifle slung. Cade raised a fist, the patrol fanned, and the silhouette did not react. We circled slow, stepping on our own shadows. From the side I saw it clearly. A guardsman's uniform filled with packed leaves and white clay, a convincing puppet rigged by threads so fine they found my skin even at a distance. The threads ran into the mist and vanished. I thought about Bren's legs and felt my calves tighten as if the memory itself had edges. Brother Eamon put a finger to his lips and pointed upward. Above our heads a mesh drifted, almost invisible, monofilament webbing strung like a cobweb by a patient architect. We walked back exactly in our footprints and left the valley to its ghost. Our hunger learned to be quiet. Rations softened into pulp against the roof of the mouth and went down like apologies. Thirst became a timeline we measured against the click of beetles that might have been machine parts. I counted breaths and lost track and started again. Somewhere behind us, boots followed that weren't ours. Too light, too sure. When I stopped, they stopped. When I walked, they walked. I began to hate the idea of footsteps. We made camp when Cade's eyes crossed an invisible threshold named "No Farther." He set the watch himself, not trusting the Kron to mean the same thing to every man. I took second watch. The world between second and third is where memory leaks. It was there the jungle decided to talk, not in words, in lungs. It inhaled in a long, slow pull that rattled the understory and exhaled a cold damp that made the back of my neck crawl. It did it again, and again. It was trying us on, seeing how we fit. I pressed my ear to the ground and heard a noise like a hive of distant engines, the churn and thrum of something beneath the soil assembling its patience. When I lifted my head, I found that Ilian was already awake, eyes open, watching me watch the earth. She whispered without breathing the word. "They're close." She didn't mean animals. When the time came to wake Cade for his shift, I leaned to speak his name and caught myself, throat closing. A voice, mine and not mine, had beaten me to it from the brush behind the tent. "Sergeant," it said pleasantly. "Hale says you're relieved." Cade's eyes opened clear. He saw my face and then the place behind me where the voice had lived a second ago. His hand found his last pistol and stayed there. He didn't shoot. Maybe because shooting meant admitting we were being spoken for. We lasted the night. Mandu dawn, if you can call that careful brightening dawn, found us as 7. Brother Eamon's bedroll lay open and filled with leaves as if the jungle had made him into a nest for something that didn't know how to be warm. His aquila rested on the rolled jacket like a chaperone. Cade took it up, weighed it in his palm as if measuring the value of a god. He didn't put it on. He held it like a report he'd have to sign and let us on. The day grew colder as if the sun had forgotten us. We trudged until speech became waste, our bodies jerking forward by habit alone. The vines had begun to move in ways the wind could not explain. Slow, rhythmic contractions, a living tide. We reached a basin filled with steam and the scent of burnt copper. It was there that Ilian stopped, lifted her rifle, and said quietly, "Something's breathing under us." The mud swelled. A bulge spread outward from her boots and then subsided like the exhale of an enormous lung. We backed away, keeping our balance with short, sharp steps. Cade's orders came low and even. No fire unless it surfaces. It feeds on sound. How he knew that I never asked. The ground beneath us was warm as skin, the pulse of it steady as a heart too large for its body. We moved on, but every step pressed against that invisible rib cage, and the rhythm of our march merged with the rhythm of the thing below. The jungle began to sink itself to our pace. Branches swaying in time, drips falling on beat, the world keeping time with the dying. The last thread of reason in me whispered that we had been swallowed whole, and were now walking through the inside of something pretending to be forest. Night arrived without warning, the sky collapsing into black between blinks. Our lumen sticks painted a small bubble of colorless light that moved with us like a fragile thought. Somewhere beyond its edge, shapes began to blink back. Eyes, perhaps, or reflections of eyes suspended in wet air. Ilian started muttering coordinates, a habit from training, like naming ghosts by their distance. Her voice steadied us until it stopped. She froze mid-sentence, rifle half raised. Then she tilted her head, listening. "They're whispering in low Gothic," she said, voice all edges. "But it's our call signs," I strained to hear. Through the static of insects and the soft churn of mud came a thin chorus, our own names spoken with affection. Each name ended in a soft laugh that tightened the spine. Bren's name came last, though Bren was dead. I saw Cade's mouth form a word and stop halfway. Fear is contagious in squads. The first cough spreads to the lungs of all. From the canopy above dropped a figure, weightless and deliberate, landing between us without a sound. Armor like glass and bone, body slender, blades curling from forearms. Its mask was an elongated grin of polished black, and behind the glass I glimpsed eyes the color of peeled fruit. It didn't attack. It only stood there, head cocked, studying us as one might study art. We held our fire, trapped between doctrine and disbelief. Then it moved. The world went white with pain. Cade fired point blank, but the creature was already elsewhere, cutting through the air with a noise like laughter being sharpened. Ilian screamed as her arms separated cleanly at the elbow, blood splashing the foliage in bright arcs that steamed on contact. Another blade glanced off my pauldron, tearing metal like cloth. I hit the ground and rolled, firing bursts into the dark, each shot carving light into the void. I saw glimpses, more figures, 3, 5, a dozen, sliding through the air on invisible strings. Their laughter braided with ours until it became indistinguishable. Cade bellowed retreat, voice cracking. We fell back, dragging Ilian firing blind. The jungle itself seemed to convulse. Roots rose like traps, vines struck like whips. The air stank of ozone and wet blood. Behind us something hissed a word I couldn't understand, and the world slowed. Every sound stretched to breaking. For a heartbeat I thought time itself had surrendered. We reached a clearing marked by the burnt husk of some old drop pod. The Drukhari did not follow. They had no need. The damage was done. Ilian's pulse fluttered under my fingers and stopped. Her eyes stayed open, watching a sky she could not see. Cade knelt beside her, laser gun still in his hands, and said nothing. His face was blank, stripped of rank and ritual. Around us, the jungle began to breathe again, slow and steady, the tempo of an organism digesting its meal. I realized then that the Drukhari were not hunting us for sport. They were teaching us how to be hunted. Every moment we survived was another lesson in their language, another note in a song we were learning by heart. When Cade finally spoke, his voice was hollow. "They want us afraid," I shook my head. "We're past that." He looked up at the canopy, eyes shining in the faint lumen light. "Then they'll teach us something worse." The jungle exhaled, long and slow, and from deep within it came an echo of our own breathing, perfectly timed. We listened, and the sound grew fainter, moving away, inviting us to follow. We did, because that's what soldiers do, even when the world is whispering their names in the dark. The clearing held us like a hand that hadn't decided whether to crush or cradle. The burnt drop pod stood at its center, a ribbed husk half sunk in peat, its metal scorched to a color that reminded me of dried blood. We ringed it because men circle anything that once fell from the sky. It feels like shelter even when it is a ruin. Ilian lay where we had set her, eyes open to a canopy that pretended not to watch. Cade closed them with 2 fingers and left a thumbprint of mud on her brow that read, "To me, like a last rank." The air cooled in a way that made sweat turn vindictive. Somewhere beyond the clearing, the jungle clicked its tongue, pleased with our arrangement. Bren's death had been a lesson in gravity. Ilian's was a lesson in grace, how quickly the body becomes an object without the voice inside it stirring the ribs. We were 7 now. Cade Voss's absence still living in our stride. Ayler, the quiet one who kept flasks like sacrament. Nesk, who laughed under his breath at nothing. Brother Ammon gone to leaves. I, who had begun to count each breath as if it were a coin I might one day need. And 2 privates whose names had already started to slip, because the jungle speaks better than memory. The Vox lay dead, a spider with its legs tucked tight. We had light enough for an hour and faith enough for less. Cade spoke the way a man shaves in a cracked mirror, carefully, unwilling to see more than necessary. We hold for 10, then we move north by the drop pod's entry mark. The mark had survived, a scorched spray of earth like a frozen explosion, short bounds, minimal noise. If they let us go, we use the mercy. Mercy felt like a word with teeth. I tasted iron on my tongue and realized I'd been clenching down hard enough to bleed. Nesk knelt by the pod and levered up a panel with the point of his bayonet. Inside lay the skeletal remains of a cogitator hardline, wires fused into a twist that looked like the root of some poisonous plant. Aller produced a glow stick from his kit and cracked it with 2 fingers. It flared and then dimmed immediately. Hungry light eaten by air that had learned appetite. He didn't curse. He pocketed the dead stick with the tact of a man tidying a body. When the wind shifted, the scent arrived after it, floral and sharp, a perfume that knew exactly where to land in the back of the throat. It wasn't the jungle. It was deliberate. I'd been told the Drukhari wore scents the way we wore flags, each compound a signature of the blade that followed it. This one made the world tilt a degree finer, edges clean enough to cut. Cade smelled it too. His chin lifted as if he could find a wind that belonged to us. None did. The first voice came from the drop pod's shell, a whisper coaxed from old metal. "Hail," it said in my cadence, my barrack softness shaved off by dread. "You're bleeding." A small part of me checked. I wasn't. The larger part understood the game and refused to look. Nesk chuckled. The sound came out wrong, like a saw catching knotty wood. A second voice answered from the tree line with Brother Eamon's patience. "The Emperor knows your name." I almost told it he didn't. Not out here, not the way we meant it. And then I remembered that disbelief is just another scent for an enemy like this. Cade lifted a hand, palm open as if to press silence into us like a poultice. A shadow crossed the clearing. No, not a shadow. A movement so fast the afterimage was all I could see. The drop pod rang with a note that hung in the air like a coin balancing on edge. Aller turned in a slow, collapsing circle, scanning for a target that refused to be a noun. The circle ended with his eyes on me. "They could have killed us," he said. "They didn't." "They're editing," Nesk muttered. Cutting the scene. The second strike had weight. A cable snapped overhead. A limb fell, trailing lianas that hissed as they brushed flak. Cade fired into the gap the way a man flings a stone at a dog to establish manners. The last bolt carbonized a slice of green and hit nothing solid. 2 meters to my left, air hardened into a shape and slid across the clearing. Armor like a sin that enjoyed itself, a helm smoothed into an obscene elegance, blades that curled and kissed the light. A Drukhari paused just long enough to look at us without contempt, which felt worse. I raised my rifle and the world narrowed to a beat and a breath. It didn't move the way things move in the gravity I know. It pivoted on a knee that seemed to have more hinges than human joints deserve. My bolt split the space its head had been and set a sapling on fire. The Drukhari was already at Cade, a smear of grace blade grazing his pauldron with a sound like silk. He drove the monster back with a series of disciplined bursts, each shot a syllable in a language I understood. No. It retreated not because it had to, but because the song wanted another verse. Shapes flickered at the edge of sight. 3, then 5, then more than number, moving branch to branch, their weight too slight to report honestly to the trees. We fell into a defensive circle that felt like liturgy. Nesk grinned wide enough to show the chip in his molar and quipped, "Because men talk when silence will otherwise kill them. At least they're pretty." A line of blood blossomed across his cheek in answer, so thin and precise it looked drawn. He blinked, surprised, and the cut opened, smiled, and ran. They played us in slow increments, taking a centimeter here, a second there, telling our fear which direction to face. When Aller fired, I heard laughter. Not mockery. Approval. The round struck a figure mid-leap. It twisted, accepted the shot in a plate of its thigh, and rewarded a lair with a nod that made bile slide up my throat. They were curators of pain, arranging our small deaths with taste. Cade reached back without looking and found my shoulder. The pressure steadied my hands. "Short burns, Hale," he said, not over Vox, but with the voice men use when they need a world to be small enough to hold. "No panic fire. Aim for the joints." I obeyed because obedience is the last luxury. The next Drukhari that broke the line came low, a blade curling up like a question. I put 3 into the seam of its shoulder and saw armor flower inward. Flesh beneath stir like poured mercury. It recoiled, not wounded enough to flee, but surprised. That felt like victory until it didn't. They changed the tempo. Sound compressed. The insect's drone pitched higher. The leaves' whisper tightened and my breathing stumbled out of step. A voice in my ear, mine again, damned mimic, said, "Run." My feet took one argument forward before Cade's grip reminded me whose orders rang true. "Hold," he said softly. The ground behind me darkened. I pivoted and saw a shape rise from the peat like a statue waking, a tangle of monofilament lines drawn tight between stakes, a purse for meat. The nearest Drukhari touched a control at its wrist and the lines trembled, eager. A memory of Bren's legs flickered across my spine with a heat that wasn't heat. Nesk made the choice for all of us. He lunged, grabbed a fallen branch, and swept it through the mesh with a snarl. The branch fell in 6 even pieces that steamed as if embarrassed by their own neatness. The Drukhari's mask tilted by a degree that communicated delight. It spoke a word I didn't know, and my bones understood it as, again. Cade broke the spell by becoming vulgar. He hurled a grenade, frag, standard issue, like a man throwing back an insult. The Drukhari scattered upward. The blast lifted peat and fungus in a soft, offended cough. Shrapnel pocked the drop pod. One fragment cut my ear and the blood came hot and honest. The jungle inhaled sharply. The perfume thickened. Every leaf seemed to lean in to listen to our hearts as if they were telling the punchline. Ayler grabbed my sleeve. His pupils were wide, swallowing iris, and his voice had dropped into the flat register of a man who has met the edge and taken its hand. "We can make them bleed," he said. "But that's not what they want. They want us to ask. They want us to invite them closer." "Then we don't," I said, though my mouth had gone dry and the word came out a ghost. From the canopy, a single figure descended on a line as fine as hunger. It stopped at eye level with Cade. Blades sheathed, head tilted like a teacher pleased with a pupil's effort. It raised one hand and with exquisite slowness, extended a finger toward the Aquila Cade had tucked at his throat. Brother Eamon's relic. Warmth leached by the cold of this art. The finger hovered a hair's breadth away, then traced the symbol in the air without touching it. A blessing turned inside out. Cade didn't flinch. He met the mask's black gaze and whispered a prayer whose words belonged to childhood. The Drukhari leaned close enough for me to see the suggestion of a mouth moving behind glass. The vox in my ear caught the sound a fraction late, translated it into a whisper in my own voice. "Confess," it said. The jungle drew a long breath and held it. It whispered again. That word I had never learned but somehow recognized. Confess. The sound folded into itself, became smaller, thinner until it was only breath. Then the Drukhari was gone, leaving the air warped behind it like glass still cooling after heat. For a while none of us moved. We just stood there with our weapons aimed at empty space, each man's shadow shaking slightly. When you survive a moment you weren't built to understand, the body keeps asking the mind to explain. Mine had nothing to give. Cade lowered his rifle first. "We break south," he said, voice hushed. Not because he feared drawing attention, but because the words themselves felt heavy. "They've had their fun." He was wrong, but leadership isn't about being right. It's about keeping others from knowing when you're not. We slipped into the trees. The jungle accepted us again, its leaves closing above like eyelids. The air reeked of that same perfume. Metal and sweetness, a seduction of the nose. I felt something shift in me as we moved. A thinning of thought. The vines had begun to shine faintly under our lumen beams, pulsing veins of green fire. Somewhere in the distance, laughter rippled through the canopy like a current. They were hunting by sound, not by sight. Every laugh a sonar ping. We marched in silence, our boots sinking in soft ground that sighed with every step. Ayler began to mutter under his breath. Fragments of liturgy mixed with numbers, the way soldiers count their way through fear. The light dimmed again. The Drukhari were turning the jungle into theater, and we were walking across their stage. Then, as if the script demanded it, something new appeared. Lanterns, dozens of them. Hanging in a perfect ring ahead, green glass cages glowing with steady, patient light. They swayed gently, though there was no wind. Between them hung figures, human silhouettes suspended from wires, boots scraping the ground in rhythm. Their armor was imperial, our colors, our unit markings. For one heart-stopping instant, I thought I recognized Voss among them. Then the light shifted and I saw the holes where their faces should be. Cade signaled halt, hand trembling once before he locked it still. "Do not engage," and he whispered. "Not unless they move." They moved, not toward us, upward. The bodies lifted, twitching like marionettes, limbs jerking to a beat we couldn't hear. Then one by one they drew knives from their own belts and slit invisible throats, spilling nothing. The Drukhari's laughter returned, rising in crescendos that seemed to come from inside our skulls. We opened fire. It was reflex, not order. Blast bolts cut the hanging shapes to pieces, but the pieces never fell. They dissolved into light, each fragment lingering a moment before fading, leaving only smoke and the afterimage of horror. When it ended, the jungle applauded in the only way it could, leaves shaking, branches creaking, a slow, mocking ovation. Nesk screamed something wordless and bolted into the undergrowth. Cade didn't try to stop him. He just watched until the sound of breaking branches vanished. Then he turned to me. "Hale," he said, "when they start to enjoy it, they stop killing fast. That's when men go missing forever." We followed Nesk's trail as best we could, guided by the faint phosphor streaks on his boots. The path narrowed, funneled downward, and ended in a clearing unlike the others. A basin of mirror water reflecting nothing but darkness. Nesk was there. He was kneeling at the edge, his rifle discarded, his face slack with awe. Above him hovered one of them. A Drukhari female, perhaps, though the concept of gender felt meaningless against that kind of beauty. Her armor glimmered like oil, and from her scalp hung long strands tipped with barbs that pulsed with faint blue light. She was whispering to him, her voice a melody that seemed to bypass air altogether. I saw his lips moving, answering her, repeating something over and over. Cade raised his pistol. I grabbed his wrist. "Wait," I said. "He's saying something." Nesk's voice was raw, childlike. "I confess. I confess. I confess." The Drukhari bent lower, cupping his chin with a hand tipped in claws as fine as needles. "Confession accepted," she said. Then she drew a thin line across his throat, precise and reverent. His blood hit the water and spread in geometric patterns, each ripple forming a perfect circle before fading. The Drukhari turned her gaze on us and smiled, a slow, deliberate curve that carried no malice, only satisfaction. Then she vanished, folding into the dark like paper into flame. Cade holstered his weapon. "We burned the body," he said, but his voice lacked conviction. "We didn't have time." The jungle was already shifting again, rearranging itself to swallow the basin. I looked down one last time. The reflection on the water showed Nesk still kneeling, even as his body sank out of sight. But in the reflection, his eyes were open and watching me. We moved without direction, driven by instinct. The scent followed, thicker now, almost visible, a haze of sweetness that coated the tongue. Aller stumbled, wiped his mouth, and found his hand streaked with black sap. "They're marking us," he said. I didn't answer. I was busy trying not to breathe too deeply. We reached a ridge overlooking what might once have been a camp. Half a dozen skeletons of HAB units leaned against each other like drunks at closing hour. A broken Chimera transport lay on its side, its tracks buried in moss. Inside, the walls were carved with symbols, not words, but shapes that echoed the marks on the trees. Each one pulsed faintly when we passed. The Drukhari had turned our technology into scripture. Cade touched one of the carvings and winced. "It's warm," he said. "Like it's alive." He turned to me, his eyes hollow. "We're in their reliquary, Hale. The jungle isn't the weapon, it's the altar." For a long time we just stood there, breathing the same thick air, knowing that the next breath might be shared with something that wasn't us. The Drukhari wanted more than blood. They wanted worship, and they'd found a world willing to give it. When the night came again, it came in colors. Luminous vines coiled up the Chimera's hull, light spilling across our armor, the air filled with whispers that slid against the skin like silk. Every sound asked the same question: "Do you understand now?" And I did, though I couldn't say it. The Emperor had taught us faith through pain. The Drukhari taught the same lesson, but better. They made beauty out of suffering. They made it make sense. Cade knelt beside the transport and began to laugh, quietly at first, then harder. "They want confession," he said. "Fine, I confess I'm afraid. I confess I'd rather die on my knees than vanish standing." He looked at me, eyes bright with fever. "Do you understand, Hale?" "They win either way," the jungle exhaled. Somewhere beyond, the Drukhari answered with laughter that sounded almost kind. We did not sleep in the reliquary of steel and symbols. Sleep would have required trust, and the only thing we trusted now was the certainty that the next hour wanted us. The Chimera's hull creaked under the weight of vines that pulsed with a patient luminescence, as if the jungle were practicing a heartbeat in case it ever needed one. Cade divided the night into watches he no longer believed in. Aller and I took the first. He sat with his back to the carved wall, hands folded as if holding a liturgy he could not bring himself to say. The carvings warmed the air near our shoulders until sweat felt like a confession. We left at false dawn and the world came with us. Leaves crowded close, almost affectionate. The light wore a green bruise, Behind us, the broken transport faded into foliage that remembered how to heal. We didn't speak of Nesk or Ilian or Bren. Names had begun to slip through our fingers like wet steel. When I tried to count our dead, the tally did not end in a number. It ended in a taste, iron, bitter, clean. I wondered if that was how the Drukhari remembered things. Not in lists, but in sensations catalogued until pleasure outweighed truth. The jungle pointed the way with a geometry of cruelty. Threads strung low enough to kiss a throat, pits disguised as soft places to sit, trees that wept a syrup that smelled like childhood sweets until the nose stopped noticing the poison. We moved through it like surgeons working blind. Instruments dulled by use. Faith blunted by repetition. Somewhere a bell rang. Not metal against metal, but bone against mirrored glass. A chime that made the hair on my arms rise as if in salute. We found the camp at midday when the sun existed only as a rumor smearing the canopy. It announced itself by scent first. Resin and blood, heat and a sweetness that was not floral but tasted of polished ivory. The clearing was careful, a circle of ground swept too clean for forest. Each boundary marked with a stake of black glass whose faces threw back our images with a delay, as if reflection itself deferred to their timing. Between the stakes hung ribbons of flensed skin cured until translucent, inscribed with patterns that weren't words so much as memories written in a hand that had never learned to be human. Inside the ring had been arranged a gallery. Trophies, yes, but more precise than trophies, curated with a tenderness that turned my stomach. Vertebrae threaded into spirals, lasgun stocks carved down to wands and balanced on points so fine the air could have cut them. A guardsman's pauldron polished into a bowl, filled with black stones that clicked against each other just enough to mimic breath. At the center stood a pillar of mirrored bone, its surface tiled with plates that caught our faces and returned them angrier or kinder or weary, according to an algebra I couldn't name. The pillar hummed. It sounded like our vox beads used to sound when they carried orders from men who were not going to die. Cade stepped into the circle without a sign of reverence, and the air accepted him as if he belonged. Aller and I followed because we had not yet learned how not to. The mirrorbone pillar flickered. For a moment my face there was not mine. It was Voss's, grinning with that fox calm he wore when cards ran hot. Then it shifted and showed Ilian's eyes just before she saw the blade, and then Bren's mouth, the jaw clenched around a scream he refused to give. I reached for the glass without meaning to. The cold touched my fingertips and spoke directly to bone. A single word formed in the glass like breath on winter air. Confess Cade read it too. I know because his shoulders dropped a fraction, and I saw the exact weight land on him. No, he said to the pillar, to the mirrors, to the galaxy. The word didn't know where to go. It stayed near his lips like steam. A shadow crossed the circle and the curator arrived. Drukhari, yes, but different from the huntresses we had seen dancing between branches. This one wore armor lacquered in the color of arterial blood and trimmed with a reflective material that made nothing visible except itself. Its helm was a slender wedge with a mouth slit that smiled even when still. On its forearms hung instruments that were not weapons until they were. Thin, articulated limbs ending in hooks, needles and mirrored petals that opened and closed with the patience of flowers. It made the Aquila sign in the air with one hand and turned it into mockery with the next motion. Then it spoke, words like sugar dissolving in acid. Welcome to the echo, it said in perfect low Gothic, accent pitched to a joke only it found funny. I am the collector of your reflections. The jungle remembers you as fear. I prefer you as music. Aller raised his rifle. The collector tilted its head and the bone pillar answered for it, reflecting our weapons as garlands. I understood that we could empty our packs into this sanctum and hit nothing that mattered. Cade must have understood too. His muzzle dipped a centimeter. Why us? He asked, which was a smaller form of why anything. The collector spread its hands and the mirrored petals opened like eyes. Because you came, it said softly. Because your meat hums with duty and that hum harmonizes so beautifully with pain. Because the Emperor teaches you that suffering refines the soul, and you have believed so well that your belief calls to us from light years away. It took a step closer. Its scent was the same we had tasted in the air, close enough now to become an intimacy. Confession is the most exquisite art. You have so much to confess. I tried to picture Terra then, its golden storms, its seas of pilgrims, the Adeptus Custodes in gilded stillness. But my mind offered me only this reflection of myself chained to a pillar, mouth open, telling the same story until my tongue frayed. The collector sensed the image and sighed, delighted. It lifted the mirrored petals and arranged them by my face, not touching, only framing. The way you frame a portrait before you decide if it deserves a wall. Say what you regret. It whispered. Make a shape of it. We will keep it safe. We will keep it forever. Aller answered first, perhaps because he had trained himself to be quiet too long, and therefore had the most to say. I left my brother on the line at Kargast because the Vox told me to hold, he said. His voice barely rose above breath. I held. The order was wrong. He died wondering why I didn't come. The mirrored petals quivered like pleased moth wings. A small line of blue light ran through them, and the pillar sang a note that made my teeth ache. In the reflection, Aller's face eased by an inch. He looked younger and more tired. The collector turned toward me. I could have said that I hesitated before shooting the figure in the grotto because I wanted it to remain beautiful a moment longer. I could have said that I watched Nesk die and part of me wished to kneel beside him and ask to be perfected. I could have said that the Emperor's name had begun to taste like metal worn thin, the way copper coins do after 1,000 thumbs. I said none of that. I did not say what mattered. I spoke a smaller truth because small truths spend cheaper. I thought of running, I murmured. When I saw the lanterns and the hanging shapes, I thought of turning and leaving Cade behind. The collector's helm tipped as if in sympathy. The petals brightened, then dimmed, dissatisfied with the size of the offering. The pillar hummed a chastened chord. You are stingy, it said. You will learn generosity. Cade stepped forward. He had not raised his rifle again, but his hands flexed around its grip like a man remembering how to use his strength. I confess, he said. And for the first time since the tree line I heard his voice as something other than order. It was a man's voice. I sent the 11th platoon into the fens 2 months ago because command wanted a path cleared. I knew the ground would swallow them. I knew the Auspex was lying. I hoped the jungle would get distracted with that meal and leave us room to move. It worked. I put my men in the swamp to buy time for another man's timetable. He looked at the pillar as if it could make penance. If there is a tally, mark me for that. The pillar's mirrored faces strobed. For an instant, Cade's reflection wore a laurel. Then it wore a collar. Then it wore nothing. The collector shivered in pleasure, and the humming rose into a thin, impending chord that tasted like lightning about to touch ground. Yes, it breathed. Now we are in key. I saw how this would end. Not in slaughter. In surrender. We would empty ourselves and they would keep what we gave. And when our bodies were finally done, they would still have our confessions singing here between mirrored bone and perfumed air. The jungle would remember us as shape and sound and sweetness. And that would be called mercy because it was not pain anymore. Merely the echo of pain arranged into a shrine. Somewhere, a branch cracked in the wrong rhythm, and the collector's head snapped toward the trees. The mirrored petals folded in a blink. The camp's scent sharpened, predatory. A new sound entered the clearing. The plosive cough of a heavy flamer waking, the deep-bellied roar of Prometheum learning to speak fire. The air went from humid to liquid heat in a breath. Fire poured into the circle in ribbons that hissed when they kissed the mirrored stakes. Vines combusted like paper given permission. The pillar moaned. The collector leapt backward with fury so pure it became elegant again, instruments snapping into killing positions. Through the gaps in the flame I saw silhouettes, 5, then 10, Astromilitarum troopers and rebreathers and flak-scorched to mat. A new voice cut the heat, amplified and steady as doctrine. By order of the 117th Command and the Ordo Hereticus Adjunct, this site is declared profane. Purge and withdraw. Cade's mouth shaped a name I didn't know he knew. Captain Sorrel. Captain Sorrel stepped through the wall of smoke as if he'd been carved out of it. His rebreather lenses glowed faintly, catching the red sheen of the flames as they devoured the collector's shrine. The squad behind him moved with mechanical calm, their movements precise, impersonal. Cleansing teams. I'd seen their type before. Men who arrive only after the dying is done, to make sure it doesn't start again. Cade stared at him like he'd just looked into a mirror that showed a version of himself he hadn't yet become. The flames painted their faces orange and gold. We called for evac, Cade said, though we both knew we hadn't. The Vox had been dead since Bren's last breath. Sorrel shook his head. We were already inbound. Too many beacons lit from this quadrant. Not all human. His voice came flat through the mask, stripped of tone, as though emotion had been declared heretical somewhere along the chain of command. The collector screamed. It wasn't a sound meant for ears. It was the hum turned inside out, a resonance that rattled bone. One of Sorrel's troopers staggered, blood running from his nose under the mask seal. Cade reacted before command could. He raised his rifle and emptied the last of his charge into the thing's torso. The round struck but didn't kill, if something like that could even die. The Drukhari's body convulsed, liquid shadows spilling from the joints of its armor, and then it fell apart like a reflection shattered under its own weight. The mirrored pillar cracked, light bleeding from its seams. The hum stopped. The sudden silence hit harder than any noise. Sorrel signaled his men. Purge pattern Sigma, nothing left standing. Promethium sprayed across the clearing. The air turned thick, heavy with the stench of burning sap and human fat. The carved relics screamed as they burned, air escaping through tiny holes, sound too close to human to ignore. I found myself clutching my helmet tight against my skull, as though I could keep the jungle's agony out by force of will. When it was done, the ground steamed. The fire had melted the mirrored stakes into slag, a dozen black tongues lolling from the soil. The air shimmered with heat and ash. Sorrel approached Cade, the crackle of his boots loud in the hush. "How many left in your patrol?" Cade didn't answer. He was looking at me. For the first time, I saw him unsure whether to stand or kneel. "3," I said quietly. My voice didn't sound like mine. "If you count me." Sorrel's eyes flicked over the ruin of the clearing. "Then the Emperor gave you mercy." He gestured to one of his men. "Get them on the Valkyrie. We'll sweep this sector before nightfall." He turned to Cade again, something unreadable in the small tilt of his head. "You'll make report to the Ordo. They'll want to know what language the enemy speaks in now." The Ordo. Even through exhaustion, the word had weight. I wondered if he knew what it meant to say it out loud here, on soil that still glowed with Xeno's fire. Cade gave a nod that could have been agreement or defeat. It didn't matter which. As they herded us out of the clearing, I looked back once. The collector's body was gone, no ash, no armor, nothing. Only the impression it had left in the earth, perfectly human-shaped, as if the ground had decided to remember the weight. The jungle trembled around it, roots curling inward to claim what was left. And in that last flicker of smoke, I thought I heard it again. That word. Confess. The path to the extraction zone wound through charred vines and blackened bark. The jungle's pulse had quieted but not died. It felt like something biding time, counting heartbeats until it could begin again. The wind carried fragments of sound, echoes of men shouting orders, the hiss of cooling metal, the slow sigh of trees collapsing under their own heat. The jungle was shedding a skin, and beneath it something new was waiting. Aller limped beside me, face streaked with ash. "Do you think they'll find all of them?" he asked. "No," I said. "They'll find enough." He nodded, eyes unfocused, lips cracked from the heat. "Good, maybe the rest will stay hidden. Maybe some things should." We reached the drop zone by dusk. The Valkyrie squatted in a patch of scorched clearing, its engines whining at idle, the air shimmering around its intakes. Sorrel gave his final orders, short and sharp, and his men moved like ghosts through the smoke. When he finally turned to Cade again, he removed his rebreather. His face was clean and almost delicate, too human for this place. "You saw what they built here," he said. "You know what must be done. If the Ordo decides this world's soul is already lost, they'll burn it clean." Cade didn't flinch. "Maybe that's what it needs." Sorrel's expression flickered, then hardened again. "Then pray you're not still here when they start." We boarded under the blood-red sky. As the Valkyrie lifted, the jungle stretched beneath us, a vast writhing wound that glowed faintly where the fire still burned. I pressed my face to the viewport. From altitude, the mirrored clearing had turned into an eye, a perfect black circle ringed with molten gold. As we rose higher, I realized it wasn't watching us leave. It was reflecting something else, a shape forming above the tree line, vast and translucent like a shadow made of sound. The vox crackled in my ear. A whisper. "My name. Hail," it said. My own voice fed back through impossible distance. "You never confessed." I closed my eyes and waited for it to fade. It didn't. It followed us all the way up, into the clouds. The Valkyrie dropped us at forward base Tertius because the map still pretended it existed. It clung to a ridge of red stone overlooking a sweep of jungle that had not yet learned our names. The wind off the plateau tasted like dust and spent promethium. The scent of burning carried up from the valley like incense offered to no one. Captain Sorrel's cleansing teams refueled with the quiet of men who understood their work too well. Cade took a cot and sat on it without sitting down, elbows on knees, the Aquila at his throat weighing more than flak. Aller stood at the perimeter, staring toward a sky that had begun to bruise. I found the field shrine by the medici tent and washed my hands in a bowl of water the color of tin. The water shook when the earth thumped, distant detonations marching toward us in their own liturgy. The vox in my ear had been muted, then dead, then woke again with my breath. It said my name when the wind dropped and the machine stopped talking. Hail. It made the syllable sound like a key, and each time I refused to turn it. In the admin shelter, an officer with a face thin enough to cut paper requested our report and typed our words with fingers that never quite touched the keys. I spoke in the slow voice you use when a thing has already happened and you can only make shapes around it. Drukhari raid elements. Captured and curated remains. Mimetic soundplay in the jungle canopy. The officer nodded while not listening. When I finished, he stamped a form and told me to drink. He didn't say water or recaf. He meant anything that kept the hands from shaking. Night put its palm over the base. The floodlights cleaved the dark into white pillars and left the rest to grow teeth. Somewhere north, Sorrel's flamer crew stitched fire along a contour line. The glow lit the undersides of clouds that had never seen stars. Cade found me by the munitions dump where drums of promethium sat like patient gods. He didn't ask if I was sleeping. He asked if my tongue had started saying prayers it hadn't learned. I told him the vox still used my voice, gentle as a confession, polite as a knife. They'll push the burn line this way by morning, he said. If we want to choose our death, we pick where to stand. He touched the Aquila and then left it alone, as if reluctant to demand anything of a symbol that had already been worked too hard. We didn't make a plan so much as lay down a path for our last hour to walk along. Aller siphoned promethium into canisters and taped fuses with the drama of a quiet man committing to noise. I checked charge packs by feel and found my hands had learned to count without me. Cade requisitioned a map and circled the valley where the jungle still breathed in deep, unrepentant swells. They'll come to watch the flames, he said. Artists admire artists. We moved before dawn because we wanted the choice to look like ours. The base fell behind us with its white light and dutiful noise. Ahead, the canopy went dark in the way of deep water. The ridge path took us along knife-edge stone. Vines draped from above as if something had been skinned in the trees and hung to dry. At the valley lip, we halted. The jungle down there had not yet burned. It rippled under a ceiling of mist with the slow contentment of a creature asleep and digesting. When the breeze shifted, a smell rose that made my mouth water and my stomach clench. Sweetness with a solvent edge. The perfume of the enemy, faint and curious. Cade placed the charges among roots fat as thighs, each canister cradled by the earth as though it had grown there. Aller strung lines of fuel between them, promethium crawling through hose with the steadiness of faith. I set the last fuse at the foot of a fig that had strangled 3 generations of trees and worn them as jewelry. The jungle noticed. Leaves tilted, ferns paled as if retreating blood. The ground pressed against my soles in that old familiar rhythm, inhale and hold. They arrived as the first fuse hissed, not in a rush, in a drift. Figures slid through the higher branches like an argument that refuses to resolve. Masks gleamed, blades yawned. Laughter drifted down as light as flour. One landed 10 paces from me, armor all curve and hunger, the faceplate polished into a smile. It cocked its head and inhaled as if sampling a wine. Confess, it said, and the word crawled under my skin to live against my ribs. I will, I said, and it made pleasure of the syllables. Cade's lighter made a small, honest click. Fire took the first hose with a kitten's curiosity and learned cruelty before it had time to grow. It ran along the line in a bright ribbon, leaping gaps, snapping at leaves that curled like mouths. The Drukhari above stilled, as if the scene had veered out of the script. Then they opened into motion, elegant and furious, their bodies a grammar of control. One alighted beside me and reached for my throat with fingers that promised music. I stepped back and put 2 clean bursts into the joint of its hip. The armor sagged like fruit cut too close to ripeness. It hissed through a smile and vanished upward in a lift that was all refusal. The first trees caught. Heat shoved at us with the confidence of a conclusion. Aller shouted a warning and hurled a canister deeper into the undergrowth. It landed, rolled, and went about its work. The valley brightened from below as if the planet had decided to remember its molten youth. Shapes moved across the red, leaping between branches that bent without breaking. Their laughter changed key. It stopped being kind, they came. Not one or two, but many. Their descent a choreography that would have been exquisite if it hadn't been doom. Cade took position at the fig whose roots had learned our fuses by heart. Aller knelt behind a tangle of fern and metal scrap, flamer braced, pilot light jittering in the heated air. I found the curve of stone where the path narrowed and turned my back to it, so that nothing could touch me there but death. And I was content to leave that handshake for later. The first Drukharian range moved so beautifully that it offended me. I put a last burst where the spear curve of its blade would be, and the bolt met metal with a shriek like pleasure denied. It flowed sideways, riposted with a flick that shaved a curl from my pauldron, and in its mirrored visor I saw myself reflected into a thinner man. Its scent hit me like a memory of a good lie. Confess, it breathed again, almost tender. Behind it others fanned, instruments ready, a pit orchestra adjusting to the conductor's hum. I confess I'm a coward, I said, and fired until the pack whined empty. I confess I want this to end. The words steadied my hand. The admission cost less than I had expected. Perhaps the jungle had already collected the balance. Fire reached the far fuses. The valley exhaled in a sheet of flame that took the leaves from above in a rush like applause. Heat folded the air. The Drukhari retreated like cats presented with an unfamiliar mirror, skittering sideways, unwilling to admit surprise. Two pressed their attack regardless, and Cade went to meet them with a slow smile that had learned its own kind of edge. He fought measured, mean, nothing like the theater they preferred. One slipped, misjudged the convenience of gravity, and Cade's last bolt caught the soft wedge beneath its arm. It folded around the hole as if hugging news it didn't want to share. Aller opened the flamer and wrote a line in the world that could not be edited. Promethium roared and turned undergrowth into architecture of orange. The Drukhari backed into branches that had already decided to be cinders and found their angles betrayed them. The perfume curdled. It smelled like beauty losing patience. Above the crackle, the Vox spoke, my voice again close as breath. Hail, if you burn it, what remains to remember you? Nothing that needs to, I said aloud and pulled the last igniter. Flame found a new throat. The valley became cathedral. Fire ladders climbed trunks and met in a vault that glowed until it hurt to want to look. The Drukhari dispersed with a disdain that admitted defeat without giving it a name. One paused at the lip of the ridge and looked back, tilting its mask as if filing us under a heading that pleased it. Then it was gone, dragging its scent behind like a curtain being closed. Cade lowered his rifle. We're not finished, he said. But they are. They never finish, I answered. The heat pushed at us as if to usher us out of our own scene. Embers turned the air to a blizzard of red insects. The jungle at last spoke in a language we understood. Crack, fall, ash. The heat broke the night. Flames crawled up the ridges and licked the sky until it blushed. When the fuel ran low, the jungle began to burn itself, branches leaning into fire as if it were a lover finally returned. We stood until the rifles grew too hot to hold and the air grew too heavy to breathe. Cade's silhouette shimmered through the smoke, helmet off, hair stuck to his skull, eyes reflecting the inferno like tiny dying suns. Aller crouched near the last canister, hands slack on the flamer's grip. The world smelled of carbon and endings. Then, for the first time since Vordrast had learned our steps, the jungle went still. The Drukhari were gone. Their laughter had burned out with the leaves. Only the wind remained, circling the valley like a priest unsure of which corpse deserved the right. I could almost believe we'd won until the light flickered in a way fire shouldn't. It shimmered, green, not red, and the shadows started to move against the direction of the flames. I blinked hard, but they stayed, thin silhouettes dancing where no bodies cast them. Each one turned its head as though searching for something it had lost. One of them turned toward me. It had my stance, my rifle, my way of breathing. The jungle wasn't haunted by them anymore. It was haunted by us. Cade staggered closer. Do you see it? I nodded. They're using us now. He grinned, teeth white with soot. Then we've become art. Aller began to laugh. Not madness, release. He lifted the flamer one last time, swept a line across the ridge, and the figures dissolved in bursts of emerald and ash. The jungle screamed. Not from pain, from memory being denied. I wanted to scream back that there was nothing left worth remembering. When the dawn came, it came wrong. The light was thin and colorless, as if the sun itself had forgotten the recipe. We stumbled down what used to be a slope and found a plateau of glass. The fire had fused the soil into a mirror. Our boots left no prints. The air tasted like metal. Cade touched the ground with his palm and hissed. Beneath the surface, something pulsed once, slow like the echo of a buried heart, and then stopped. "We sealed it," he said. Whatever it was, the vox clicked in my ear. Static at first, then my own voice again, clearer now, calmer. "Confess," it said. "It's almost beautiful, isn't it?" Cade drew his pistol and fired into the sky as though that could puncture the voice. The shot vanished without echo. He looked at me, half smiling, half apologizing. "Maybe it's still listening." "It always was," I said. He nodded. "Then let it hear." He holstered the pistol, straightened his shoulders, and walked into the last patch of smoke where the flames were still chewing on the earth. I opened my mouth to call him back, but the words refused to leave. They tasted too much like mercy. The fire took him without ceremony. When the light flared, I saw his shadow stretch long and thin until it joined the others moving across the glass. Aller and I waited until the wind shifted and the valley sighed its final breath. Then he turned to me, eyes hollowed but steady. "Orders?" I looked at the sky, where the clouds had begun to mirror the glow below. "Same as always," I said. "Survive long enough to tell someone what it cost." We climbed until the burned world fell away behind us. The air cooled. The vox stayed silent. On the horizon, I could see Sorrel's next fire line already cutting its way toward the sea, an unbroken chain of light meant to sterilize, to forget. I wondered if he knew he was writing scripture in flame, if he understood that the Emperor's mercy and the Drukhari's art weren't so different when seen from orbit. When we reached the ridge, I stopped and looked back one last time. The canopy was gone. In its place stretched a plane of black glass that reflected the dawn, and for a heartbeat I thought I saw movement beneath it. A flicker of green, a shadow turning its head. The world breathed once more, shallow but alive. I keyed the recorder in my helm. "Final transmission," I said. "Patrol designation Theta 9. Mission incomplete. Enemy engagement concluded by mutual extinction. If this reaches anyone, remember us as men who burned a forest to keep the night from learning our names." The vox hummed gently, waiting. Then softly my voice, no, not mine anymore, answered. "Acknowledged." I shut the channel and walked until the jungle's ghosts could no longer find my reflection.